My time in the middle of a manhunt for an escaped murderer, plus the Second Amendment Foundation's Adam Kraut on their fight against New Mexico's gun carry ban. That and more on this episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Gutowski. I'm also the founder of thereload.com and a CNN contributor. You can head over to thereload.com right now if you would like to sign up for our free weekly newsletter to keep up to date with what's going on with guns in America. You can also, of course, buy a membership if you want to get exclusive access to hundreds of pieces of analysis that you won't find anywhere else, as well as the ability to listen to the show a day early and appear on the show in a member segment if you'd like. So this week, we are talking about the big news of the week of really in quite a while, I think, the New Mexico governor's emergency order suspending gun carry rights of all kinds, open carry, concealed carry with or without a permit in the state's largest city, Albuquerque, and the surrounding county. And we have someone with us who is directly involved in the legal fight against this order, and that is Executive Director of the Second Amendment Foundation, Adam Kraut. Welcome to the show, Adam. It's nice to have you here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Can you tell people a little bit more about yourself?
Sure. So I guess I'm an attorney. I spent 5 years in private practice doing firearms-related stuff, both for individuals and industry when I first started practicing law, and then I moved over to the nonprofit world, managing litigation on a national scale for the last 3 years before I moved over here to the Second Amendment Foundation, where I'm now the executive director and still doing some of the legal stuff, managing litigation in addition to everything else that an executive director would do.
Yes, and tell us a little bit about this case that you guys have filed against the New Mexico governor. What's the claims you brought? What are the basics of this case?
Sure. So the New Mexico governor issued that executive order, and as a result of that, the health secretary issued an order which banned carry. It was a direct result of the governor's executive order. And that just flat out doesn't comport with the Second Amendment and the right to bear arms, particularly if you look post-Bruin and what the Supreme Court has said. There's no way you can possibly square the two. And so the order that was issued was for a limited time basis. It was for 30 days. But that still doesn't mean that there isn't, in fact, like a constitutional injury that occurs just because it expires, in a theoretically a short temporal period of time versus a law that could be there forever, if you will. And so that was why you saw all these lawsuits, ours and there were, I think, 5 current ones, and why they all sought temporary restraining orders, because you're looking for quick relief from the court and you're not looking for something to, take a little bit more time to get that relief, particularly given the short nature of that order.
Right. I think they're up to 6 now. I believe the NRA has filed one alongside a lot of the elected Republicans in New Mexico as well. Sure. And so there's been a ton of action on this. And so what's the latest in the case? You guys have been able to secure that temporary restraining order, correct?
Yes. So we, along with everyone else in the 5 lawsuits, there was a hearing for the temporary restraining order about 2 days ago, I think now. The judge granted the TRO from the bench, and with a very limited written opinion that followed it, that just kind of covered the very basics of, I think there's enough here to grant this and kind of keep the status quo of people which should be able to exercise their right, with a hearing for the preliminary injunction to follow on, I believe, October 3rd. At which point the TRO will expire, and then it'll just be a question as to whether or not he finds that, I'm going to preliminary enjoin this and more or less continue this restraining order against the governor while the case is litigated.
Right. And your arguments in this case were basically that this order just straight up violates the Second Amendment. Now, the governor has argued essentially that the Second Amendment is not unlimited, that even her oath of office is not unlimited apparently, and that because she issued this emergency order, that gives her the authority to sort of infringe upon the right to keep and bear arms. What is the counter to that argument, that these emergency powers enable her for a temporary period to do this?
Well, it just doesn't flat out square with what the Constitution says. There's if you look at the emergency powers that were enacted, after post Katrina, there were instances of rights being restricted as far as confiscation and also limits on people carrying. And courts found that that was not permissible to do. Her usage of a public health emergency to try to square this is not something that passes constitutional muster. And you more importantly, if you look at what the Supreme Court has said, first, if you just look at the plain text of the Second Amendment, right, there's a right to bear arms. Now, if you look at the case law that's evolved from that, courts have said, okay, you have a right to bear arms, and that right could be open carry or it could be concealed carry. And if the state restricts one or makes it more difficult to utilize one over the other, that kind of squares with the Constitution, because you still have the ability to do it. It just may not be the preference, your manner of preference. So if concealed carry is restricted but open carry is allowed, you may not prefer open carry, but you still have the ability to carry an arm for self-defense. If you look at what Bruin said, it's like, yeah, you have a right to bear arms in public. And not only do you have that right to bear arms, the places in which the government can restrict that right is limited. And they specifically enumerated 3 places that were, legislative assemblies, polling places, courthouses. And they said that there's a common theme behind all of those, and that's that there's comprehensive state provided security. So when you just take that and you go, cool, we're going to ban carry, and we're going to ban carry literally everywhere in this county or in this city based on something else, it doesn't square with what the Constitution requires. And that's the basis for all of this.
I don't think that the Supreme Court has weighed in on, emergency powers and the ability to restrict gun rights in those circumstances. I know we had some cases. Obviously you talked about Katrina and the aftermath of that. And then there were also a couple, obviously, cases out of the COVID pandemic where they shut down gun stores and stuff. And I think the record there is a little more mixed, right? So I guess, do you foresee this becoming a major case that goes perhaps up to the Supreme Court, or do you think this is going to be settled where it is now in the district level?
I think that's going to depend from a procedural aspect as to where the case goes. Certainly questions as to when that order expires. Are there claims alleged that would allow it to not be moot? Like seeking nominal damages. The Supreme Court is a way to has said is a way to keep a case alive after that injury has in fact passed. So it's going to be, I think it's going to be questionable, and it's going to be really questionable as to what the district court decides. If the district court, finds that, okay, yes, the governor did in fact violate the Second Amendment in this context and these people's rights, it could result in the district court just issuing an opinion. And if the governor's office looks at it and says, you know what, and the defendants more broadly go, you know what, we're just not going to challenge that. We're not going to raise it on appeal. It dies at the district court. And it's going to be a question, I think, really of what the district court decides and then what the party found against decides to do. So it's hard for me to predict. And I think this one's less clear cut than if you took, say, a state that passed an assault weapons ban, where they clearly want their assault weapons ban to stand, and they're going to appeal that, up at least maybe to the circuit court. I don't know if they'd be too keen on that going to SCOTUS at this point, but
yeah, certainly. And I guess, that's one of the key questions here for plaintiffs like you guys. What are you seeking in terms of damages? How do you see this extending beyond that 30-day period if the governor sort of gives up on trying to enforce this? Is there a plan that you have to continue this fight on after that point?
So the relief we sought was, obviously a temporary restraining order and then preliminary and permanent injunctive release, as well as a declaration that, it was in fact a violation of these people's rights. So we had nominal damages in our complaint, which would allow it to, if the order expired and the governor took no further action as far as trying to revive it and keep it going, it would allow the case to continue based on that past constitutional injury, and you could, in theory, get that permanent injunctive relief, and that would, theoretically stop the governor from pursuing this kind of stuff again in the future, going down this roadway. what the governor will do. She's been out there defending it, but at the same time, gun control advocates have been pretty keen on distancing themselves from her on this one. The usual suspects, if you will, that are pretty vocal about supporting any kind of governmental action that infringes or restricts people's rights have kind of said, like, well, hold on a second, this one's a bridge too far for even us. So if that's the hill she wants to die on, I guess that's up to her. But I don't think she's going to find a lot of support from anybody externally saying, like, yeah, you should really keep going on this one.
Yeah, speaking of that sort of pushback she's received, that actually includes her own attorney general, right, who's also a Democrat, who's refused to defend this law. And I'm wondering how that works out in the legal case and whether you've ever seen something like that before with one of these orders restricting guns.
So I can't say I've necessarily seen it in this context, at least not that comes to mind. There have been instances in the past of attorney generals refusing to enforce or defend laws that they don't personally agree with or they think that there are constitutional issues with. I didn't see his letter, but I did see a couple of news articles on it. And, he said, you're welcome to hire your own counsel to defend you on this. It's not something the state would be doing. That he couldn't swear it, with the Constitution, and that his oath of office that he took. Not only did he take an oath of office swearing to defend the New Mexico Constitution, but also the federal Constitution, and he just didn't think he could ethically step in to defend this order based on his oath of office. And I also saw in that article that apparently the governor wasn't asking him to do that. So, I don't know, but he made it clear that he thought there were issues with it from a constitutional standpoint. And I guess if he was asked, would not be interested in defending her order.
How does that play into your strategy in this case? Are you able to take that sort of letter from the state's, highest attorney or some of these local law enforcement officials who've said basically the same thing about the constitutionality of this rule and incorporate that into your arguments in the case, or that's sort of ancillary?
I mean, it's probably ancillary. Could you do it? Sure. Would it help support your position? Yeah, I guess to some extent. I don't think it's where you want to stake your flag. Certainly, there's much better arguments that would come before it. So if you wanted to throw it in as a tertiary thing, that look, even these people, the highest law enforcement officer of the state is saying constitutionally this is problematic for persuasive purposes, you could do it. It would be certainly if there had been a written opinion issued by him, and not just a letter to the governor, but a written opinion from the AG as to the constitutionality of an action, that would be more useful in that context. But here, I don't even think it's necessary because this is just so overbroad. I think the deck is already stacked enough that you could toss it in, but it's not gonna be the thing that tips the scales.
Right. And, when we're talking about the emergency order aspect of this, right, she's using this emergency order as the basis for issuing this suspension of gun carry rights. And she's arguing that gun violence has become such a significant problem in Albuquerque and the surrounding county that she needed to take bold action. But when you look at the actual crime rate there, you look at statistics from the Albuquerque Police Department, murder is actually down significantly from the previous year. Through June, they've seen a 21% decrease compared to the previous period in 2022. So how does that stack up when you're going to consider these legal arguments in the case? Does that matter at all? Does it, like, the fact that it seems to be perhaps based on very shaky grounds in terms of whether there even is an emergency at play, or does that even not come into to the argument in this case?
Yeah, it shouldn't matter. If we go all the way back to Heller said the test in Second Amendment cases was text as informed by the nation's history and tradition. And then what you had happen for, I don't know, what was it, 13, 14 years, courts went, yeah, that's great. We're gonna apply this different test where it was a means and scrutiny test where they looked at the government interest and what the stuff behind it was, and they landed on intermediate scrutiny almost always. It was almost never strict scrutiny, which was the highest tier that the government would have to clear in order to justify its ban or restriction. Under that old test, those statistics would have been relevant because the governor could say, well, look, there is a crime issue, and because crimes are being committed with firearms and there's a high likelihood of either serious bodily injury or death, that's the basis for this restriction, and it's justified because the government has a compelling or a very vested interest in keeping its population safe. Bruin reiterated what was said in Heller. No, the test is the text of the Second Amendment as informed by the nation's history and tradition. And if you look at the language in Bruin, it goes on to say that when there were problems that existed in society that have transcended, the generations, this is not a new problem. Look, put another way, people committing crime with firearms is not novel to the 21st century. It's something that existed at the time of the founding and all the way through. And when there weren't these restrictions throughout history, particularly at the time of the founding, which is the relevant time period to look at, it's essentially that they considered this and they said, the Second Amendment protects this kind of conduct, and these restrictions are not something that are constitutionally permissible. So all that to say, her using crime as a justification, it doesn't fly for any number of reasons, including that's not the test we use today. And even if it was the test, if you were to look at the statistics, it doesn't support the proposition that she's offering it for anyway.
Okay, so sort of regardless of whether or not crime is on the rise, or you can make if she'd been in a better position to make this argument that there's an emergency, none of that really matters in your view as far as whether this is a constitutional action for her to take, just because essentially any attempt to suspend carry rights for any reason is going to be a violation of the Second Amendment. Is that the basic idea?
That's the basic idea, without delving too far into the weeds as to, are there some historical bases where it may have been permissible? If you want to talk about emergency powers and wartime stuff, were certain populations disarmed? Yeah, but that's really digging into the weeds. I think as a general premise, your summation of it is correct.
Yeah, and I actually maybe get into those weeds a little bit, because there is some tradition, I suppose, of disarming populations that during the founding that were, for instance, people who didn't take loyalty oaths were often disarmed during the founding. But that's not going to be historically analogous to just disarming everybody in Albuquerque, right? I guess is the argument.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's exactly right. So, part of what also Bruin had said was that those restrictions, if they're not a dead ringer, and a lot of them are not going to necessarily be based on changes in society for some things, that they do need to be historically analogous, and it needs to not be so far removed. So, for example, when you're restricting carry in parks, you can't necessarily rely on laws that restricted carry on somebody's land for the purposes of to prevent poaching. And if you look at a lot of these cases, the historical laws that are being cited, the proposition they're being cited for, you can't extrapolate it and apply it in a logical manner without really doing some mental gymnastics just to say, well, we want to ban carry here, or we want to ban this thing here. So when you look at history, there were certain groups that were disarmed, particularly at the time of the founding, those who were deemed loyal to the crown. They were a threat, and it was more so in the sense of an insurrection than anything else. Not that they were going out committing crime, but it was an insurrection, potential insurrectionists against the government. So there were a few populations, and actually one of my former colleagues, Joe Greenlee, has written extensively about this. And if I encourage any of your listeners, if they're all interested, he's written some very detailed things about these types of people that were prohibited in the past, and bars on these kinds of things. But he really gets into the specific subset of groups that at some point in time were disarmed and the reason behind why they were disarmed. But to bring it all home, those restrictions on who are not historically analogous to just banning carry for everybody by the city or in this county.
Okay. And so where do you expect things to go from here? Do you expect the governor to try and fight this TRO? Do you expect the judge to issue a preliminary injunction? on October 3rd after that hearing? Do you think there will be appeals? Like, how do you see this ending up?
Well, so the TRO is non-appealable, so that's going to remain in effect. That preliminary injunction hearing, I think it's going to be a question as to what the state, if any, evidence, the governor's office rather, brings to the table to try to justify it, and whether any of that is at all appealing to the court for the basis of, not granting a preliminary injunction. But I would say if a preliminary injunction is granted, I would be surprised if she appealed that order. Not impossible, but I would be kind of surprised. And if that is granted, then I think you might see the order expire. By that point, it's probably close to being on its way out from just a time period. I don't know offhand what the exact date it's supposed to expire is. And then from there, we'll see how many of these cases remain alive based on claims that were made that would allow them to continue after that order expires, and what a final judgment looks like. But I would be surprised. But I've been wrong many times before, so it very well may go up on appeal if a preliminary injunction is granted.
Sure. And do you, I guess, at the end of the day, right now it's blocked under this temporary restraining order, but I guess the concern is that, if it expires before you get a preliminary injunction, a final ruling from the district judge, that perhaps the governor could try this again sometime in the future. Do you expect, some of these, nominal damages claims and stuff like that you mentioned will end up succeeding in keeping her from ever being able to do this again? Or is there, we're going to end up in a situation where, it expired and we didn't get a final ruling from a judge, so it's still a little bit of an open question?
So I think the way some of these cases were structured, it will allow for a final judgment on the merits. And I would be kind of surprised, not to say that it's impossible, but I'd be kind of surprised if the governor's office doesn't really show up with anything different than it showed up with to the TRO hearing, if the judge doesn't either from the bench or very quickly after say like, okay, preliminary injunctions granted, written opinion to follow. That's one way he could square it so that the restraint on the governor and the defendants from enforcing this, would just continue on through. There would be no temporal lapse from it anyway.
And what do you make of, I guess, this sort of the rush to file cases against this ban? There were so many people who filed so fast, and then the combined with the backlash that you saw across the board from really all sides of the political aisle. And then the fact that this judge who issued the temporary restraining order is a Biden appointee. Like, what do you make of all this? It seems like she's run up against both the legal limits of gun control and the political limits at the same time.
So I think all of those lawsuits being filed was a very clear indicator that everybody saw this as a gross violation of constitutional rights. And the temporary restraining order aspect of it really reinforces the fact that not only did we think that that was the case, we were so confident that we would get a temporary restraining order. When you look at Second Amendment cases across the board, TROs are almost never sought, and they're even less granted. Preliminary injunctions sought more often than TROs granted. So I think it was very clear to everybody looking at it from our side of the fence that there's issues here. From the other side of the fence, you very clearly saw people going, there's issues here, because they're publicly saying, you have politicians publicly saying that we don't think this is constitutional. What are you doing? You should back off. You have people that are advocates for an opposing viewpoint that are saying, this is a bridge too far. Like, really, maybe you shouldn't do this. And then the judge being a Biden appointee, that's lawyers look at judges all the time when they're looking at venues, and both sides do this, right? They want to find a judge that's appointed by the party of they think is most favorable to them. It's not necessarily indicative all the time. Sometimes there's horse trading that goes on during administrations where senators will say, like, we'll give you this confirmation if you give us a yes on this vote. And there's some horse trading done. But I think what it really shows is that, a judge should be looking at what the letter of the law says and not what party they're from. Does it always happen? No, it doesn't always happen. But here, the judge, I think if you look at his opinion, and again, it was very brief, but he says, this is what Bruin commands. This is where things are. And based on that, I'm going to temporarily restrain the enforcement of this order until we're able to have a better hearing on the merits of the preliminary injunction. But all signs are pointing to like this is an issue. And so I think the governor is probably really out here on an island at the end of the day, where she doesn't have the political support from her peers. She has 6 lawsuits now against her challenging this, and she's been temporarily restrained in 5 of them already. So, it's not looking great for her. And I would be surprised if the odds shifted in her favor in any manner.
Yeah, certainly. And speaking of that, I mean, that politics is a little bit like the NFL. By the way, the Eagles won yesterday, beat the Vikings 2-0. But it's a little bit like the NFL in that people copycat each other when they see something successful happen. And so, and perhaps they abandon things when they notice one of their colleagues is getting crushed over it. Do you think that's going to happen here? I mean, is this basically, a pass that's gone incomplete and you're not going to see it? Other governors try this move in the future?
I think, again, predicting the future is impossible. And I hate trying to do that, but I think this is one of those instances where it's so clear. And to some extent you could say, or you could just flat out say, it was a political ploy. I'm doing something. And clearly she's trying to capitalize on the I'm doing something aspect of it. Something had to be done. But I think you'd be hard pressed to see other governors who want to go down this particular pathway. Is it possible they may try to do something else using, an emergency basis to restrict, a constitutional right in some other manner, Second Amendment right in some other manner that perhaps is a little more limited than this? Sure, I suppose that's possible, but I think such a just far-reaching, like this goes real far. I would say it's probably unlikely, particularly given how this one's turned out. And it just as another point on that, you mentioned, it replicating, people copying. I think a good place to kind of point that at is all these Bruin response bills, right? We're still on the issue of carry, but you have New York after Bruin was decided, it passed its sensitive places bill. You have New Jersey, you have Maryland, you have Hawaii, and now California. And they're all very similar to one another, if not, almost verbatim the same. And you would think that they would look and see how these are going in court, particularly. Okay, well, maybe we should hold off and wait. And I don't know. Sometimes it's a game of, well, I'm in a different circuit, and this circuit's probably more favorable based on past experience. So, let's just try it, or we've got nothing to lose. And at the end of the day, I think that is something to keep in the back of our minds, is that these government officials a lot of times have nothing to lose. It doesn't cost them a dime. We're paying to fight ourselves. Our tax dollars are going to defend something that we believe is unconstitutional. And those of us that are involved in advocacy groups or groups that file lawsuits, we're making donations and joining to fight our tax dollars. So, just food for thought on that.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. And I think it also underlines how unique this particular situation is, because, a lot of those Bruin response bills have lost in court repeatedly, the early ones in New York and New Jersey. Mm-hmm. And you still saw other deep blue states follow their lead anyway. But it doesn't seem like that's how things are going to go with Governor Grisham's order here, at least as things stand now. And so I think that's one of the things that makes it fairly remarkable.
Yeah. Like I said, I think you would be hard pressed to see somebody else trying to replicate this, at least in this exact manner. If it's an emergency powers thing and they may try to, find some way to limit the scope, possible, but I guess time's going to be the arbiter of whether anybody steps up to the plate and swings or not.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, before we head over to our news update here, can you tell people a little bit about where they can find more of you and the Second Amendment Foundation? Sure.
So me, nowhere really. The Second Amendment Foundation, SAF.org, so SAF.org. That's our website. You can head over there. You can get updates on all our cases. In addition to learning a little bit more about the organization itself. The organization's on social media. So if you look for Second Amendment Foundation on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, And then our handle on Twitter is 2AFDN. And you can find us there as well. So those would be the best places.
Yeah. And of course, you guys have the Gun Rights Policy Conference coming up really shortly here. I guess
it's next week.
weekend, isn't it? In Phoenix, Arizona. I'll be speaking. I'm sure you will be there as well.
I will.
So
Yes.
I'm looking forward to that. Tell people a little bit about, I guess, how they can attend if they want to.
Sure. So the Gun Rights Policy Conference, this is the 38th annual one. It's a joint event between the Second Amendment Foundation and the Citizens Committee for the Right to Keep and Bear Arms. And it's really a gathering of all the scholars, lawyers, activists, the people that are on the forefront of Second Amendment rights and seeking to preserve them and restore them and expand them. So you'll be able to hear from a variety of speakers on a number of topics dealing with Second Amendment issues. If you are in the Phoenix area, you can, again, head on over to our website, saf.org/GRPC for Gun Rights Policy Conference, and you can register there. We ask that you pre-register because we do provide lunch. If you're unable to attend in person, it will be live streamed. I believe it will be on, at the very least, Facebook and Twitter, and I think YouTube as well. And we'll be posting more information about that. Just off the top of my head, I don't recall all the links. So.
All right. Wonderful. Well, I will be there. You'll be there. Hopefully people listening will also be there, and we will see you guys in Phoenix. That's it for this week. We're going to head over to our news update now.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, it's time for the weekly news update. I'm contributing writer Jake Fogleman, joined, of course, by Reload founder Stephen Gutowski. How are we doing this week, Steve?
I'm feeling better today. We're filming on Thursday, and I got back home Wednesday night, and I was able to get some sleep. So I feel a bit better. Still a little bit exhausted from this whole situation I was involved with up in Pennsylvania, but feeling a bit better. How about you?
Yeah, I'm doing pretty well. I'm pretty excited. I'm going to a really good friend's wedding this weekend, so got that to look forward to.
Nice.
Certainly cheerier situations than what you've experienced, which we'll get into later in the podcast. But
yeah, well, we could get into it right now, actually. It was a pretty insane situation that I just got done dealing with. Many of you listening have probably followed the news on this manhunt in Chester County, Pennsylvania. What you might not know is that's where I grew up. That's where I'm from, Chester County. I grew up in Downingtown. If you watch the podcast, you'll see this sign over my shoulder is from Victory Brewery. That's in Downingtown, Pennsylvania. That's where they're from. If you're in the sort of mid-Atlantic area, you probably have seen them before. But that's where they're based, and that's where I grew up. And this escape of this murderer happened right by there in the Chester County prison. I guess it's not like a maximum security facility. I think he was just there holding until he got transferred to another prison. And so he took that opportunity to break out. And initially I was a bit worried because that's Westchester. I have family, friends who still live down in that area. Of course, they're in a little more populated area, so I wasn't super concerned about it. And then it sort of dragged on for a while, right? It's been like 2 weeks since he escaped. And he stole a car because I wasn't super worried at first, right? Because the farm where my mom lives is still probably about 45-minute drive, if not a little more than that, from where he broke out. So it seemed super likely he was going to end up there. And it's like, why would he end up there? It's a bunch of horse farms and woods. There's not really any reason why he might show up at my mom's farm. But unfortunately, after he stole that van, that's where he ended up. He drove up north to the area where my mom's farm is, and he abandoned the van. And unfortunately, on Tuesday, I got news that he had broken into, he went into someone's garage and stole their rifle. And that was right by the farm. So, and they still hadn't caught him at that point. And so, yeah, I decided it was best if I took some of my guns and went up there for a while until they found him or he showed up on the farm, one or the other.
Yeah, definitely a pretty scary situation. One, like you said, you're talking about a murderer that is convicted of at least 2 murders, one in his home country and then one here in the States. And once a weapon gets involved, that's a pretty scary situation, especially as you said, he's right in your neck of the woods. So,
yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, it was bad enough when he was just out there on his own because he had stabbed his girlfriend to death in front of her children. So he's a pretty disgusting person who also, clearly preys on vulnerable people, like he's murdering his girlfriend. He's not a big guy. He's like 5 foot, and there was a lot of people making fun of that and all and whatever. But it certainly seems like the kind of guy who might prey on my grandparents, for instance, who live across the street from the farm, or even my mom and stepdad are older as well, and so. And none of them have, my grandfather has his old service pistol from when he was a cop, but he's 90 years old now and not as mobile as he used to be. So, it's just with that much space between the farm, it's not a huge farm, right? It's a couple acres. It's a horse farm. They have 3 horses and some chickens and dogs and cats, but it's not a working farm or anything like that. But it's still a large space to try and cover. And then my grandparents live across the street in their own house. So you kind of, for one person or even for a couple of people, it's not easy to keep a watch over that whole area when somebody is out there. And so that's why, plus he had a rifle. It was a 22, right, is what he stole. And when they caught him, he still had it. So, it was a threat the whole time, but he was even more of a threat when he had that gun. And while a 22 is not super powerful, a rifle, he can still reach out and touch you from far away with that. And if you're going up against that with a handgun, even one with a higher caliber, 9mm or something, it's not you're still at a disadvantage if he's far enough away from you. And so I brought up my AR. It's this AR here that you always see on screen if you watch this on YouTube. And, yeah, I mean, and I sort of, the other big problem is that we all assumed that he was sleeping or hiding during the day and then traveling around at night, and that's why he wasn't being caught most likely, because it's easier to hide and people won't spot you necessarily as well at night unless, obviously the police that were out there with thermal and heat, all kinds of night vision stuff, and they were using helicopters and planes and all this, but he was still at large, almost 2 weeks later. So obviously that wasn't a sort of silver bullet situation where we'll just immediately find him. That's not how it works in a manhunt like that. And by the time he got to the farm, that area is very, there's a lot of place to hide, whether it's in farm buildings, on the outskirts of the farm or whatever, or in the woods. And they caught him in the woods. So, it seems like he was done. And he said, I guess they've done interviews with him, and he said he was living off of watermelon and stream water. And he was just, he would like scope out place before he went to steal something from. He stole from several houses along the way. Obviously, he stole a car at one point. And he said his plan was to carjack somebody and try to drive to Canada, which is obviously not a very logical plan, but the guy's very desperate. He's going to spend the rest of his life in prison. He doesn't want to do that. And so I'm sure he would have been willing to do anything at that point. But so I just had to go up there. And since we all thought he was traveling at night, that meant that I had to stay up and try and keep an eye out on the farm and my grandparents' house through the night, which was very stressful and difficult to do. They had, technically the farm was outside of the area where they had the roads closed. It was right on the edge of it, but the police were saying, oh, he's cornered in this area. It's a very large area. First of all, it's like Warwick Furnace is the name of the area. And so clearly they didn't know exactly where he was, or they would have had him by that point, on Tuesday when they were talking about this. And Tuesday night, they're flying helicopters and planes right over our farm. So it gave the impression that maybe they didn't know he was inside that area. Now, so they turned out to be right, thankfully, because that's where they caught him. But that whole night was a huge ordeal.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
And yeah, I mean, and this has been a problem on the farm before. I just hadn't worried as much about it. They have motion sensing lights. Have you ever had motion sensing lights?
Yeah, the house I grew up in as a kid, our back area, anytime something would go by, the floodlights would turn on. Yeah,
exactly. And they can be very sensitive, right?
Oh yeah. Anytime a rabbit or a squirrel or anything went by it, that thing would light up.
Or like the wind blows too hard on a branch or something.
Yeah.
And so that was the situation. Our lights, we have one on the barn, which is right next to my mom's house. And then we have one on the side of my grandparents' house. And they go off all the time, you know, which is terrible for this situation.
Right.
Because, you know, anytime one of those goes off, it could be him trying to, you know, get in somewhere, steal something, attack somebody, whatever. Sure. And so, you know, I was watching the Phillies game at my grandparents' place. It's at night, you know, it's probably 8:30, 9 o'clock at night, pitch black out. Helicopters and planes are flying overhead. And then their light goes off. And so I had to take my gun and go out there, my AR, and, you know, clear the area. It was pine corners. It was doing all the stuff that you learn to do when you take different gun defense training courses. And using the light to shine into all the dark areas, the little wood creek area right next to their place. So he wasn't there, obviously, thankfully, but I did that a couple times throughout the night, and it was awful.
Yeah, I say that sounds nerve-wracking.
It really was, and thankfully they caught him at like 8 a.m. They had, you know, before I think I got maybe 2 or 3 hours of sleep, and at one point at like 1 a.m, there was chatter on the police scanner about how they identified a heat signature in this area of woods near where the sort of tractor dealer is by the farm. And but the problem was, like, that turned out to be right. That turned out to be where he was, and which is great. However, it took him another 7 hours to actually catch him after that point. So when you're in it, you're not really confident that that's actually him.
Sure.
And, you know, they had a dog that eventually found him, thankfully. Trained dog. I think he was a Border Patrol dog. They had Border Patrol out there. They had everyone, basically. ATF, FBI, state police, SRTs, which, you know, I'm very thankful to those guys. I ran into some state troopers when I was grabbing dinner, and, you know, they were coming in from Pittsburgh. So, it was, you know, guys were coming in from all over the place. I think that dog was from Detroit, was stationed with a unit in Detroit. Wow. So, yeah, they were bringing people in from all over the place to try and find this guy, and they did. And, you know, I'm thankful for them. And, you know, the one other thing, too, by the way, we've talked a lot about in this little personal segment of the show about, you know, my different guns and carrying in your guns and our experiences with, you know, trying out new carry setups and new guns and equipment and stuff. And I was super disappointed in my Sig Sauer P320X macro. It was the same issue that I had before, for people who've been listening for a long time. That came with a Romeo Zero Elite or whatever from the factory, right? And what was my problem with that when I first got it?
I say your red dot died in the first couple weeks or whatever it was.
Yeah. Yep. And I thought, well, maybe it was just some weird thing from the gun sitting out, or some of the battery was the issue. And so I replaced it. Right. And, well, when I went to take that thing to go up to the farm, guess what happened again?
Oh no. The
battery was dead again, which sure indicates to me that it's not a battery problem. It's something wrong with that sight. And, yeah, so I used my old Springfield XDS 4.0 instead to carry around as my sidearm when I was up there as my carry gun. And super disappointing. Even this AR, you really got to keep up with this stuff, right? Your guns that you're relying on. This goes back to why people don't like smart guns. They don't like red dots. They don't like anything electronic, even if they could see a value in it. Like this gun here, my AR, that mostly sits on this wall, and I use it at the range occasionally. Not having a lot of people break into my apartment, so I'm not employing it often for the worst case scenario purpose of it. But when I went to check all the batteries on this thing, on the light and the red dot, they were both dead. And then the red dot, when I replaced that battery with a new one, the new battery also didn't work. And so I thought maybe it's a sight mark, not a very expensive sight, but it hadn't had issues with it before. And then I guess it turned out to be the battery or something, because when I put another new battery in it, then it was okay. And it's still working. It's, I don't love the setup because it's one where you have to physically turn it on and off. Now it had been sitting off, so I don't know why the battery died. It should have been fine because it hadn't been used in a while. But I guess there's some phantom drain that goes on there even with it off. And that was unfortunate. And the just the same thing with the light. It just needed a new battery, but you really got to stay on top of that stuff. Right?
I would say
you're going to run into some situation like this.
I would say that's a good lesson for everybody that relies on these tools for, you don't get to pick when, you actually need it for its worst case scenario purpose. And you better hope that your stuff's maintained or it's quality stuff that will hold up, because like you said, you don't get to pick when you actually need it for the worst case scenario purpose. So. Right.
And this was I was in a lucky situation in that sense that I was able to check this stuff before I went out there.
Right.
Whereas if somebody was breaking into my apartment, now the gun still would have worked. It's still a gun. But I wouldn't have had the red dot and I wouldn't have had the light if I'd been in a situation where I needed the rifle at home. But so that's just reinforce that whole basic principle of maintaining your gear and checking it fairly frequently to make sure it's still operating properly. A lot of lessons taken away from it. Luckily, nothing bad came to pass. He wasn't able to attack anyone else. And he never made it to my farm. He made it real close, though.
Yeah,
real close.
Way too close for comfort.
That's for sure. But so, what do we got this week in terms of news stories? What headlines we have?
Sure. Yeah. So links in the newsletter. We have a story from the local PBS affiliate in Philadelphia, because the Pennsylvania Supreme Court just heard oral arguments in that the city's challenge to Pennsylvania's preemption law. So I don't know what is this, the 25th challenge of Philadelphia against that preemption law. It's sort of an ongoing saga that will just keep going until there's a final decision made, I think. Yeah, they do it all the time. The problem, I think, for gun rights advocates and Professor Robert Leiter, I was talking to him the other day about this, and he might write a piece for us about this. Hopefully, we'll see if he has the time, but he's really concerned about this one, or at least thinks it's extremely notable, because the issue is essentially Philly is arguing that the city has like a duty to protect its citizens, and therefore it has like a right to pass these gun control laws beyond what the state allows them to do. So it's a very novel argument about that the city itself as an entity has a right to pass these laws, and the state is violating its rights with this state law that prevents them from doing it. So there's never been a ruling that I'm aware of that was in line with this argument. However, there still might not be after this case. There was, I think, Firearms Policy Coalition live tweeted this argument, and it didn't sound like it was going well. Now that's a gun rights group live tweeting it, so they're usually fairly reliable on those, on just relaying what's happening in an oral argument that they live tweet. But obviously they have a point of view as well. And the main concern you would have as a gun rights advocate for this case is that they took it at all, right? Because the lower court, I believe, ruled against Philadelphia. Yeah.
So there's some that's one of the things when you're reading tea leaves with the top court in a state or the Supreme Court of the United States, whether they take a case at all, it can be an indication of how they might rule on it. And the thing with Philadelphia's Supreme Court, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, is that it's an elected court. And while I believe the campaigns are nonpartisan, they still line up fairly straightforwardly with the parties. And
Sure.
I believe the split right now is 4-2 in favor of the Democrats or Democrat aligned justices there. So, that gives you pause when you consider it just from the practical tea leaf reading side of things. Like maybe they will side with Philly. And if they do that, it's going to be a huge deal because, first of all, Pennsylvania has thousands of localities. It's fairly unique in that regard. Like it has way more local government divisions than most states do. And if they're all able to just pass their own gun restrictions, it's going to become a real mess up there if you're trying to travel around in Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
Because Philadelphia will pass every gun restriction you could imagine. They already do that without the authority to do it. So we're going to definitely keep an eye on where that one goes for sure.
Yeah. That sounds like Colorado. Colorado's the same way they call them like metro districts and special districts. And there's, like you said, thousands of tiny individual governments that, because Colorado repealed its preemption law, they now have the authority to pass their own gun laws. So it could be a similar situation. Yeah. And they have. I saw
that. They've had a number of them have had their laws enjoined because they passed their own assault weapons bans.
Right? I say Bruin is the caveat, obviously, to all of this because of the Bruin test, but
so,
could be a big situation. We'll keep on top of.
But it's easier to challenge one state law than it is to challenge 1,000 local ordinances. That's
absolutely. Sure. So the next story we got comes from the Courthouse News Service. It's about a pretty interesting ruling out of the Ninth Circuit. That they heard an appeal of an injunction denial from a lower court where some gun rights advocates were challenging California's open carry ban. And the Ninth Circuit ruled that court did the preliminary injunction test wrong, apparently. So he essentially ordered it to rehear it. And you talk about reading tea leaves with judges. They don't really say it explicitly, but anytime a judge or a higher court sends something back to a lower court and says, do this again because you did it wrong, it's in so many words is saying basically rule the other way. Sort of an interesting thing that might happen in California with open carry.
Yeah, that is fascinating. We'll have to keep an eye on that one as well.
Yeah. And then the last link we'll hit today is a similar story to one we've covered in the past, where the NSSF has been challenging some of this new wave of state laws, trying to make it easier to sue the gun industry for crimes committed with firearms by third parties, usually under some sort of public nuisance statute. So this case is covered by Reuters. It's out of Delaware. And in this case, once again, a judge dismissed it because he said that the NSSF doesn't have standing because it hasn't been enforced yet. So it's kind of this weird in-between state that we're all stuck in with these laws because these states have these laws on the books, but they haven't enforced them yet. And so judges are saying, well, there's no injury, can't challenge it.
Yeah, that's a significant hurdle for the industry because these laws obviously implicate gun businesses, but it seems like some of the judges in these jurisdictions are requiring them to wait until somebody's actually been sued over this stuff before they can bring these kinds of challenges to the constitutionality of the law. But the last thing we're going to talk about today is, the main interview, we talked about the legal side of the New Mexico governor's emergency order banning, it's basically suspending gun carry rights, at least in Albuquerque and the surrounding county. But I wanted to talk a little bit with you about your piece. You have an analysis piece for members that looks at the politics of this situation. So what's your basic thesis here?
Yeah, so I think the politics of this one in particular are fascinating. This kind of ties back to our discussion about Philadelphia and the preemption battles. It's not an uncommon thing to see left-leaning or progressive or however you want to phrase it, gun control supporting politicians, whether they're at the local level or the state level, really push the envelope when they enact some sweeping gun policy. So, for example, Philadelphia all the time tries to pass its own either carry restrictions or assault weapon bans or what have you even though state law explicitly prohibits them from doing so. And they know they lose in court all the time, but they do it anyway because it's a very progressive city. The Democratic city council or the mayor or whatever who enacts these policies isn't going to get punished for doing so. So it becomes a political victory for them. Same thing with California and New Jersey when they pass these Bruin response bills that have been enjoined several times by federal judges, but it doesn't matter because to their voters, it looks like they're doing something for gun violence. And what I found fascinating in this case is you have a Democratic governor in a reliably blue state, New Mexico, doing something similar, a very out there gun policies, taking a bold stand against gun violence in Albuquerque. But instead of praise, she's received almost unanimous criticism from even members of her own party. You've seen her own attorney general say that he's not going to defend her in court. Letters have come. That's huge, right? That's huge. Yeah. And both chambers of the legislature, there's been lawmakers, Democratic lawmakers, that have issued letters and public statements saying that what she's doing is unconstitutional and they can't support it and that she should rescind it. You have national gun control figures like David Hogg from March for Our Lives. You have the Democratic representative from California, Ted Lieu, calling her unconstitutional, what she's doing unconstitutional. So I think it's definitely a turning point where there seems to be at least a limit to what these sort of antagonistic, quasi-performative gun control measures. And clearly, Governor Lujan Grisham kind of hit the wall when it comes to where that limit is.
Yeah, it sure seems like it. They've really set the new floor, I think, for the gun debate because, especially the comments from like Hogg and Lieu, because they're effectively admitting that gun carry is protected in the Constitution. Now, look, this is something that the Supreme Court has explicitly said in Bruin. Like they said that, yes, the Second Amendment protects gun carry, but the gun control groups have by and large taken issue with that. And many of them are still of the opinion that the Second Amendment is a collective right. It doesn't really do much of anything, frankly. But, it kind of shows you where the debate has moved now, which is interesting, right? Because in the 60s, most of those groups that existed at the time were for banning handguns. That was the big push at the time. After, the Gun Control Act passed and you had some of these other gun control laws passed, they were having a lot of success. And the next thing they wanted to do was ban handguns. And that didn't happen and it became the new floor for a while. You couldn't ban handguns. It's extremely unpopular to try and ban handguns. Polling indicates it's, it's like a 70-30, 80-20 sort of issue. And so they gave up on that aspect and moved to other policies that they've been pursuing since then, assault weapons bans and universal background checks, things of that nature. And now, you're seeing a retreat, I think, strategically from May issue laws, right? That those were struck down in the Bruin case, which were effective bans on gun carry. I mean, outside of a very small fraction of applicants, most people couldn't actually obtain a permit to carry a gun in states that had that policy. And then now they've moved to shall issue. And so that's sort of the new floor for gun carry. Like they're still opposed to constitutional carry, right? Permitless carry. Constitutional carry is what advocates call it, obviously. And so they're still, you're at this point where they're, where they're at least willing to say that a total ban on gun carry, even for a limited period, because of an emergency order is not something they can support. And that is a change, I think. Yeah.
No, that's a great point to make too, because not only is it just calling out sort of the performative nature of the policy itself, but it is an acknowledgement that, hey, even the gun control side acknowledges there is a right to carry and it's not something you can violate. Because like you said, many of them, or at least some of the groups want to relitigate Heller and all these other cases, but to see them publicly make statements saying that, look, there's a right to carry. You can't just toss that out the window on a whim. So it's pretty big.
It is. And, I think it also comes from sort of the hair thin nature of the order in the first place.
Sure, sure.
This idea that there's an emergency in Albuquerque, New Mexico, that justifies this kind of suspension of rights there's not a lot of evidence behind that. The governor cites the murder of an 11-year-old, which is obviously horrendous, tragic thing. Unsolved murder, I would also note, is a road rage incident where, nobody knows who that person was. And certainly there isn't any evidence there's a connection to people who have concealed carry permits. And I would venture to guess that it's very unlikely that that person who murdered an 11-year-old had a concealed carry permit. They don't, not that people with concealed carry permits, they're all perfect angels, but on average, they're much more law-abiding than the rest of the population, oftentimes even more than police, depending on the statistics that you're looking at. But at the same time, if you look at Albuquerque's own crime statistics that they've released, crime is way down. Murder, according to the Albuquerque's police department, declined 21% in the first half of this year compared to the previous year. So the idea that there's a gun violence emergency runs counter to what the actual data says in the place where she's declared this. So there's not really a lot of justification to stand behind as to why this was necessary to do. She's kind of just saying it's sort of there to send a message. And I think threatening to arrest law-abiding people for carrying firearms for their own defense is not a great way to send a message to anyone. Right? It doesn't make any sense. You could already arrest criminals carrying guns because they can't, if they're a convicted felon or if they have a domestic violence misdemeanor, or they're underage, they can't carry guns anyway. It's already illegal. You can already arrest those people.
Right.
So it doesn't really send any message to them. It's just the whole situation very poorly thought through, it seems. And she didn't even do the footwork to see if her fellow Democrats in her own state were going to stand behind this. And clearly they haven't. Right.
Yeah. The Bernalillo County Sheriff himself said that he was shocked and irritated by the order because he wasn't consulted at all about it. So poor strategy, poor policy. And it's just remarkable to see how swift the condemnation was from all sides. And I think that's the fascinating political takeaway.
Yeah, for sure. Well, people can head over to thereload.com and pick up a membership today if they want to read the full analysis that you have put on our website there, or if they want to get the access to hundreds of other pieces of analysis that we have that you won't find literally anywhere else in the world, on the internet, anywhere, just at The Reload. So sign up today for our free newsletter if you just want to get an idea of what we're like, and then go ahead and make that jump into paid membership if you want to support our reporting and also get access to all of that exclusive content. You'll also get this podcast a day earlier and the opportunity to appear on the show in a member segment. We'll have to do one of those again real soon. But that's it for this week. We will see you all again real soon.